Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for braving the lovely weather out there to make it to our lecture today. I hope it wasn't too difficult. Before I begin today's lecture, just wanted to briefly point out that most of you, if you haven't already, will be getting your midterm tests back. And for the most part, from what I've heard from the TAs, the results were pretty positive. I hope they were for you. The important thing isn't so much what grade you got. The important thing at this point is that you understand why you got the grade that you got. In other words, if your grade is somewhat disappointing to you, it is not so much appropriate at this point to panic or drop the class or something along those lines. Perhaps you're thinking about that, and that's your choice ultimately. But what's much more important is that you understand why you got the grade that you got. Because the midterm test is only worth a fairly small portion of your final grade, and consequently there's plenty of room for improving your grade if, for whatever reason, you fell short of your expectations on the midterm. What's important in that regard is that before you put your test away, make sure that you read over the comments that were left by the TA that hopefully will explain to you where you fell short of the expectations and what you needed to do to improve your grade. If after having looked over those comments, you are still not sure where you went wrong or why you got the grade that you got, the first step to take is to go and speak to your TAs about it. They will be able to provide you with a better explanation as to why you got the grade that you got. If after having consulted with your TAs, you're still not sure of why you got the grade that you got, then ultimately the buck stops with me. And in that case, I would ask you simply to write up a short little paragraph or so explaining why you think that the paper does not, or the grade on your paper does not reflect the quality of your paper. And I would be happy to take a look at it, to reevaluate it, and to come to my own conclusions, and either if it's appropriate, change your grade, or if it's not appropriate, at least provide you with a more detailed explanation of the grade that you got. Again, I hope that's not necessary. Generally, it isn't necessary. As I pointed out, most important is that you understand why you got the grade that you got, in large part because the final exam is going to be very similar to the midterm. Very similar, not in the sense that it'll cover the exact same material, it certainly will not, but rather similar in terms of the nature of the test itself. Basically, where we had 2 essay questions, of which you had to answer 1 on the midterm, the final exam will have 3 essay questions, of which you have to answer 2. And the nature of those questions will be somewhat similar. In other words, they will be fairly broad in scope and ask you to engage the material that we've covered since the final exam. Since the midterm. Again, just to let you know what's coming at you, the final exam will, it's hard to say whether it will be cumulative or not. It will focus on the material that we've covered since the midterm, but the material that we covered prior to the midterm will nonetheless be relevant to your answers. In other words, you should certainly still be aware of what realism is, what liberalism is, and so on and so forth in answering those questions. Before I get into any new material, let me see if there's any quick questions or comments about anything that we've covered thus far. If not, then let me pick up where we left off last class. Last class we began to look at conflict after the Cold War. What I want to do today is to turn our attention to international organizations and international law. To understand the role of international relations and international law and the kinds of controversies that are involved in international organizations and international law, it is, can everyone see that? Should I blow those up a little bit? Probably would be appropriate. Just a second. That's too much. There, that's the sweet spot. That better? In order to understand the importance of international organizations and the controversies surrounding international organizations, it's probably best to return to our discussions of the different approaches that have been taken by various scholars in trying to understand international politics. As such, international organizations form an important component of the understandings of international politics, in particular for liberals. Liberals have long argued that humans are capable of cooperation under the right circumstances, and that what is important to do in order to avoid conflict is to create those kinds of circumstances to facilitate cooperation. And as we discussed in a couple of lectures ago, one form of that cooperation is certainly the establishment of trade regimes. In other words, to facilitate as much trade between states as possible, because the assumption for liberals is that trade will benefit all that participate in it by allowing them to specialize on those things that they do best, and not to bother trying to produce things that they are not very good at producing. By specializing on those things that they can do efficiently, they raise their standard of living. And by using the revenues generated to that to import things that are not produced efficiently within their own borders, ultimately they, as well as their trading partners, will increase their standards of living, their ability to consume, and so on. And insofar as states therefore become more interdependent with one another, more dependent on each other, and insofar as trading also involves things like communication, like a melding of cultures and so on and so forth, conflict between these states becomes less likely. Another important component of liberal thought with regard to international politics, however, is that we need more than simple trade in order to eliminate the possibility of war, or the frequency and prevalence of war in the international system. That what is required as well is various forms of organization. Various forms of organization. And those forms of organization aren't just necessary in regard to diplomacy and the relationship between states, but also to facilitate the emergence of trade regimes. In that regard, the image or the vision of liberalism is very well embodied in the history of Europe since the end of the Second World War. Essentially, the history of Europe since the end of the Second World War, and by that I mean the rise of the European Union, is very much a liberal project. It's a liberal project that, as I pointed out before, began with various aspects of free trade negotiations. They started with the European coal and steel community, in which coal and steel resources were pooled among the member countries. Then it expanded in the form of the European community to other aspects of their economies, and eventually formed the European Union. Along with this free trade within the realm of Europe, however, or along with that increase in trade, went the creation of institutions. Institutions for the governance of that territory that hopefully would cement the gains in trade and integration, and furthermore provide political institutions equivalent to the economic integration that would further facilitate the emergence of a European identity, a European culture as opposed to separate cultures, and ultimately make war between the various states of Europe unthinkable. And in that regard, the European Union has, at least so far, been enormously successful. Germany and France, which on 3 occasions in the previous century made war against each other and practically destroyed each other, have no longer had major conflicts since the end of the Second World War. And to many in Europe, the idea of a war between Germany and France is increasingly unthinkable. And up until fairly recently, the assumption with regard to the European Union was embodied in the European Union program itself. In other words, an ever closer alignment, an ever closer union of the various member countries. The reason that it's now coming under pressure is complex, and we'll talk about that in more detail as we move forward. But this issue in particular has become prominent in the news in the last few days by virtue of the fact that Great Britain, which has always been a sort of a holdout in the European Union, has decided to renegotiate its arrangement with the European Union, and in particular to abandon the idea of an ever closer union. And that has created some doubts as to the inevitability of this project ultimately succeeding in creating a super state, or a supranational entity that eclipses the sovereignty of its member states, such that Germany and France and Luxembourg and so on will no longer be sovereign states, but will be the equivalent of provinces within Canada. Provinces within Canada certainly still have authority over certain aspects of the life of their citizens, but they are not sovereign entities. They are part of a sovereign state of Canada, and there is no doubt in the minds of most Canadians that sovereignty really resides in Canada. In that same sense, The project for the European Union was basically likewise to create a sense of European identity, to create legitimate institutions, to settle the various differences between European partners, and ultimately to eclipse the sovereignty of those separate states. The European Union is still nowhere near that, and whether it will ever approach that is very much an open question. But basically the idea among liberals is that the same thing can be accomplished on a global level. On a global level, again, by promoting free trade globally at this point, and this is a topic that we'll take up in a few more weeks when we talk about globalization. But along with that come various institutions. Institutions for the settlement of disputes between different states. And the idea is that as states become more and more dependent on each other, as they develop what Joseph Nye calls complex interdependencies, conflict between these various states will become less and less likely, more and more unthinkable, somewhat like this relationship between Germany and France. But what is also required are various institutions, A, to promote those kinds of, that kind of free trade arrangement, and we talked about that a little bit when we were talking about international political economy, and talked about the various institutions that we call the Bretton Woods system, including the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and so on and so forth. But it also requires political institutions. And what I'm going to talk about today are the political institutions that have been created essentially to accomplish that project. And the most important of those political institutions is, of course, the United Nations. The purpose of the United Nations, declared in the very first sentence of the UN Charter, is to end the scourge of war that has been a plague of humanity throughout the ages. That is its very purpose, to create an arena within which states can settle their differences by peaceful means. Is the project of the United Nations ultimately to displace sovereign states? The United Nations never was quite that ambitious, although in the long term, quite clearly, liberals would view that as a desirable goal, but not one that has so far been declared. For liberals, therefore, international organizations, as well as international law, which are closely associated with international organizations, are crucial means by which humanity can overcome the problems of the international system, the problems of the war of all against all, so ably described by many realists. Liberals, in that sense, to go back to the question on your exam, are optimists. They think that this kind of progress is not only possible, but is almost inevitable, in the same way that they saw the emergence of the European Union as something that is largely irreversible. A problem that is emerging now because the idea that the European Union might have to be reversed never occurred to the architects of the European Union, and consequently they never made any provision for how a country might withdraw from the European Union. And this is one of the big problems that the European Union faces today, where it would make a great deal of sense for countries like Greece, for example, to withdraw from the European Union and to adopt their own currencies again. But there were no mechanisms for doing so, and consequently, the very suggestion merely creates conflict. In other words, if the Greeks were to re-adopt their own currency, what currency would their debt be denominated in euros or in drachmas? Well, the Europeans probably wouldn't accept it if it was in drachmas, because the Lord only knows what they're likely to be worth. On the other hand, the Greeks won't accept it if it's in euros for similar kinds of reasons. In other words, the European Union in that regard has set itself up for considerable conflict and considerable uncertainty. But let's not talk too much about the European Union. Let's talk about international organization and international law. And a good place to move forward in that regard is to look at why realists tend to be much more pessimistic about the prospects of international law and the prospects of international organizations as means of settling the differences between different states. Why are realists pessimistic in this regard? Well, we talked a little bit about human nature and the idea that humans are inherently selfish and so on and so forth, and I won't repeat all of that, as important as it is in their basic understanding of politics and international relations as a whole. But suffice it to say that realists see the international arena as anarchic, anarchic. In other words, there is no sovereign, there is no overriding power able to impose order on that system. It therefore is a self-help system in which each sovereign state is responsible for its own security. And some sovereign states are perfectly capable of maintaining their own security. Those are the powers that we generally refer to as great powers, that have enough military power, enough economic power to protect their own borders and to keep their adversaries in the international system at bay. Others are inherently weaker within that system and consequently are not capable of being authors of their own security and consequently have little or no choice but to ally themselves in one way or another with the greater powers in order to gain that protection. And the greater powers are likely to ally themselves with these and guarantee the security of these smaller states only insofar as there's something in it for them. In other words, if they can gain in terms of their own security by doing so. The upshot of that is, to describe the international system, realists generally point out that the international system is a system in which the powerful do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. The weak suffer what they must. Now, what should be implicit in that regard is that the great powers have little or nothing to gain from international organizations. Have little or nothing to gain from international organizations. The great powers, the powerful, do what they will. The weak suffer what they must. Now, why would the great powers therefore ever give up that situation where they can do whatever the heck they want and pursue their goals in whatever means that they want? That's a tough question. Normally, in discussions of the United Nations today, in particular in the media, and therefore you have to kind of look at what you're reading in the media and the pronouncements of major politicians, we get the impression that the main supporters of international organizations are countries like the United States. Countries like the United States that are the responsible members of the international community and that have to look out and keep in line rogue states like North Korea or Sudan or Syria and so on and so forth that are the violators of international law and that have to be kept in check by international organizations. That's for the most part very, very misleading. Very, very misleading. Essentially, it's not the great powers that have an interest in international organizations. Great powers, by definition, are those that can protect themselves in the international system and that are powerful enough, essentially, to be able to pursue their goals, their interests, by whatever means they choose. The international environment is not a threat for great powers. It is a threat for weaker powers. It is a threat for weaker powers that have to suffer what they must, as the adage puts it. In other words, the main motivation for creating international organizations aren't the great powers, it's the smaller powers, it's the weaker powers that have something to gain by it. And in that regard, realists argue that from the point of view of great powers will sign up for international organizations and support those international organizations only if they see them as a means of enhancing their power, of enhancing their security. But will very quickly reject those international organizations if they pose a threat to their ability to act freely. And that's an important thing to understand. It's an important thing to understand in particular if we look at the emergence of various international organizations historically. From the point of view of realism, therefore, international organizations can only become established insofar as their makeup, their constitution, reflects the balance of power in the international system, but not insofar as they are means by which that arrangement of power can be altered. The upshot of that is that, well, there have been two experiments with creating international organizations, one of which was the League of Nations. The League of Nations, we discussed, emerged after this First World War and was very much a liberal project, primarily advocated by the liberal President of the United States, who happened to also be a political science professor prior to becoming president, and very much committed to liberal views of international politics. And he sought to establish the League of Nations, in essence to make World War I the war to end all wars. With that international organization, and the collective security arrangement that went along with it, war would become a thing of the past. As we all know, it didn't work out that way. It didn't work out that way in large part, as realists often point out, because the makeup of the League of Nations necessarily had to reflect the balance of power in the international system. And that meant that the great powers, those like Great Britain, like France, like the United States, and so on and so forth, would only accept the creation of the League of Nations insofar as it didn't damage their interests. And they, of course, became the main means by which the League of Nations was to function. They became the biggest actors within the League of Nations. How did the League of Nations ultimately fail? Well, it was intended as a system of collective security. And what is meant by collective security is that any member of the League of Nations was, at least in principle, committed to the idea that if a state within the international system became aggressive toward one of its neighbors, that all of the international community would come to the defense of that weaker state that was under attack. And that, in turn, is a pretty tall order. Basically, it means that, and it's, by the way, the same thing that is the case with any kind of alliance system, like NATO and so on and so forth. NATO is meaningful only insofar as every member of NATO is committed to the idea that if one member of NATO is attacked, all of the others will come to that member's defense. And that means that every member of NATO is, to a certain extent, a liability for the other members of NATO. One of the problems with discussions, for example, of whether to admit countries like the Ukraine or like Georgia to NATO often boil down to discussions that seem sort of like, well, do you like or support Ukraine or don't you? And that's really a complete misplacement. You can like the Ukraine plenty and the Ukrainian people plenty, but still argue Ukraine should not be in NATO. Why? Because Ukraine does not add anything to the security of other NATO members, but commits those other NATO members to making major sacrifices if Ukraine was actually ever attacked. In that regard, every state, every member of the organization has to decide whether this is really in their interests or not, whether they want to be tied to possibly becoming involved in a war in which they don't actually have any stake. Yeah?
Isn't those cases of like NATO members going to war against each other, like notably Greece?
There has been an incident, and it was a highly embarrassing incident of two NATO countries going to war against each other, and that was the conflict over Cyprus in the 1970s. It's actually an ongoing conflict, a frozen conflict of sorts, somewhat like the Korean War and like various other conflicts in Eastern Europe. Moldova and Georgia are similar instances in which essentially the island of Cyprus became divided between Turkish half and a Greek half. But yes, that was an embarrassing moment for NATO indeed. But I don't want to talk too much about NATO. Let's get back to international organizations like the League of Nations and like the United Nations. Well, the League of Nations failed for a number of different reasons. One reason it failed is because the United States never became a member. And the reason that the United States never became a member is precisely because of that problem. Members of Congress that would have had to approve the Treaty of Versailles that created the League of Nations would have had to commit the United States to come to the defense of countries like Ethiopia, for example, where the United States had no interest if they were to be attacked by one of their neighbors. And I chose Ethiopia deliberately because Ethiopia was, in the 1930s, invaded by Italy. And Italy was one of those core members, and the invasion of Ethiopia was quite clearly a violation of international law and of the precepts of the League of Nations. And if the League of Nations had been a functioning organization, they would have constrained Italy in its ability to do so. But Italy was a European state that didn't have a lot of colonies, in large part because it was relatively late on the scene of developing within Europe. And all of the other major members of the League of Nations were countries like France and Great Britain and so on that had extensive colonies. And who were they to deny Italy an attempt to get its own colony and so on? And furthermore, none of them had a real interest in the sovereignty of Ethiopia, and certainly weren't willing to surrender their soldiers to a battle with Italy over their sovereignty. And consequently, the League of Nations ultimately failed in that particular role, in that particular instance. Something very similar occurred on the other end of the planet. One of the other core members of the League of Nations was Japan, another one of the great powers. Japan, also in the 1930s, invaded Manchuria. Again, a violation of the precepts of the League of Nations that should certainly have brought about a collective security response, but it wasn't in anyone's interest, in the interest of any of the great powers, to start a fight with Japan over what appeared to many European and Western and North American countries as the trivial region of Manchuria. And thus the Japanese were able to get away with that. And ultimately, of course, the League of Nations failed to prevent World War II. Realists argue that that's in large part because international organizations always must reflect the balance of power within the international system. And that means that they have to not challenge the interests of the great powers. If they challenge the interests of the great powers can do as they wish. And the weak have to suffer what they must. And the great powers will simply pull out of that arrangement. And in that regard, the same kind of dynamic, to a large extent, applies to the emergence of the United Nations. The United Nations was the second attempt, again, to a large extent, advocated by the government of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who likewise, like his counterpart Woodrow Wilson, was committed to liberal views of international politics as a means of settling international affairs by peaceful means. But in order to get people to go along with that, he had to get every country in the planet to sign up. Getting the weak countries to sign up was not a problem. Every weak country in the system signed up very willingly and very enthusiastically, because the League of the United Nations promised protection for their sovereignty, promised the imposition of international law to regulate the behavior of states and so on and so forth. It wasn't the smaller powers that were a problem in creating the League of Nations. It never is the smaller powers that are a problem in creating an organization like the United Nations. It was the great powers. Why would the great powers, countries like China, like Russia, like France, like Britain, like the United States, sign up for something along those lines? Well, the answer is they wouldn't, unless they had guarantees that that organization could never impinge upon their basic interests. Now, how did that work itself out in the United Nations? It worked itself out in the creation of the United Nations, in particular in the core institutions of the United Nations. The United Nations consists of two very important core institutions. One is the General Assembly. The General Assembly essentially has representatives from every member of state in the United Nations, and they meet starting in September, and you've probably seen the various speeches that have been given by various state leaders to the General Assembly. It is generally considered to be the democratic component of the League of Nations because it represents every state equally. Now, critics would very quickly point out that that's not particularly democratic. Sounds democratic on the face of things, that every state gets one vote, but that means that the Marshall Islands get the same voting power in the General Assembly as China. The Marshall Islands have a few 100,000 residents. China has more than 1.5 billion. So certainly it's not one person, one vote. It's one state, one vote, which isn't exactly egalitarian. But understandable enough under the circumstances, since they're all sovereign states. But the General Assembly does not have a great deal of power. Its power is mostly symbolic. People make speeches, they pass various resolutions, but those resolutions are essentially recommendations. Recommendations that create certain expectations that shouldn't be dismissed as completely insignificant. They certainly attempt to create international norms, and some of those international norms are widely observed and therefore become considered as part of international law. But the General Assembly does not have the power to enforce its decisions, on those that do not want to abide by them. They are simply recommendations. The more important institution, therefore, of the United Nations is the Security Council. And the Security Council consists of 20 members, 5 of which are core members, are permanent members. And those 5 permanent members are China, Russia, France, Great Britain, and the United States. Now, why would that be? Why would these 5 powers have veto power?
Because they won World War II.
Because they were the victorious parties in World War II, and consequently designed the post-war order, and therefore excluded countries like Germany and Japan, but also excluded many others, and not permanently excluded in the sense that they do, on occasion, get one of the rotating seats on the Security Council. But the more important thing is that the Security Council can make decisions that are binding and can authorize the use of military force. However, each of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council have veto power, meaning that the only way that you could convince powers like the United States, like the Soviet Union, like China, like Great Britain, like France, the powerful, to sign on is insofar as they were given explicit guarantees that nothing the UN would do could ever negatively affect their interests. They have veto power. And they've used that veto power fairly extensively. For that reason, essentially, realists tend to argue that they don't deny that the international organizations can have an impact on the international order, can on occasion have a positive role in settling disputes, in monitoring various arrangements of peace treaties and ceasefires and so on and so forth, the way they're currently trying to do it in Syria. But ultimately, they argue they don't change the basic picture. They don't change the basic picture of an international system consisting of sovereign states in which the powerful can do what they wish and the weak suffer what they must. Let me briefly turn to Marxism and its understanding of international organizations. I say briefly by virtue of the fact that Marxists are not really that far in this regard from realists. Essentially, Marxists argue that international organizations, just like political organizations within states, are a reflection of the balance of power within the particular system that they're intended to oversee. In other words, when it comes to understanding states and the role states play within their own societies, Marxists argue that states are the means by which the dominant groups within a society maintain their position as dominant groups within that society and suppress those that are subservient to those dominant groups. The state, in that sense, is a tool of the dominant classes. In international relations, they would argue that international organizations are therefore the tool of the most powerful to maintain the status quo, to maintain themselves as the most powerful, and to maintain the stability of that existing distribution of wealth and power within the international system. In that regard, it is interesting to note that there has been little in the way of adjustment in the United Nations institutions since the Second World War. One of the reasons for that is essentially that the core members that have been privileged by how the United Nations has been set up, in other words, those 5 permanent members, are very unlikely to want to give that same power to any other state, even if those other states have become much more powerful in the meantime. So, for example, Germany and Japan have long advocated for getting a permanent seat on the Security Council. They have never gotten one. And it's easy to understand why Germany and Japan would make that claim. Germany and Japan both have economies that are bigger than the French or the British economy and are important players in the international system. But they first and foremost have to convince those existing permanent members of the Security Council to adjust that institution, and for the most part have failed to do so. Perhaps even more importantly, countries like Brazil and India, India perhaps being the most important example, have also advocated for getting a permanent seat on the Security Council for obvious reasons. India was a colony when the United Nations was first designed, and therefore was not a major player. But in the meantime, it is a fairly important country with a very large economy and with a population of over 1 billion. And consequently should also, that importance should also be reflected in the international organizations. Again, the core members of the United Nations have resisted any changes to the makeup of the Security Council for obvious reasons. It diffuses their ability to act and to protect their own interests. In that regard, Marxists argue that international organizations, like their domestic counterparts, are means by which the powerful entrench themselves in power. Let me turn to international law briefly. International law is something that's closely associated with international organizations. And international law can take a couple of different forms, which I'll talk about in a minute. Actually, let me kind of move us ahead a little bit. International law has, to a certain extent, existed longer than international organizations. Although international law is always something that is a little bit tricky, in that international law, while it has existed, at least since the time of the Treaty of Westphalia, is always problematic. We have all sorts of laws on the books in Canada, and they are meaningful, not because they're on the books, but because they're enforced, and because there's power behind it to enforce it, so that anyone that violates those laws can be held to account and can be sanctioned in various ways, thrown in jail, or even executed if they violate the law in significant enough ways. International law, in that sense, exists in a kind of a vacuum. In other words, it exists on paper in the form of treaties, but there is no overarching organization capable of enforcing those international laws. And consequently, for much of the history of international law, it was not entirely meaningless. It certainly created certain kinds of conventions, but not particularly effective, certainly not in preventing wars and things along those lines. International law emerged primarily in the form of treaties, in the form of various treaties between sovereign states. And the first and most important treaty in that regard was the Treaty of Westphalia, which we talked about, and which is why we call the current system of states the Westphalian system of states. It defined the rights of monarchs. The rights of monarchs as the supreme power within a particular jurisdiction, able to raise armies and tax the citizens. Roughly 3/4 of a century later, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed in 1713 that created the institution of sovereignty, of territorial sovereignty, and associated with it the institutions of diplomacy. Basically the idea that no state had the right to interfere in the internal affairs of neighboring states. Those states were sovereign. And again, sovereignty remains a cornerstone of international law to this day. There were a number of others, and I won't take you through the entire list of various treaties. Suffice it to say that these international laws were not particularly effective in diminishing conflict, but were effective in creating means by which states communicated with each other and tried to settle disputes with each other. In that regard, the emergence of diplomacy was an important development that required a treaty, in that it went against the instincts of most states that were in conflict with their neighbors for whatever reason. When a conflict arose between two neighboring countries over a stretch of territory or something along those lines, and war was threatened, it was very difficult to send somebody across to negotiate with the foreign power without risking their life. In that sense, that had to be something that was established firmly, that certain people enjoy immunity, that diplomats enjoy immunity, and cannot be treated the way that a soldier from an opposing army would be treated in a situation of conflict. Basically, this was seen as absolutely necessary to prevent constant warfare. In the absence of the ability of states to communicate, the only way to settle any dispute, no matter how trivial, was to resort to arms. And that's enormously expensive and enormously wasteful, especially when the conflict is over relatively trivial matters. Consequently, it made sense for everyone to institute that idea that there are certain individuals that are declared as diplomats and that enjoy immunity, that can travel to the capital of their adversaries and negotiate on behalf of their home government. So that was certainly an important component of international law, but it created a set of institutions of diplomacy and diplomatic recognition that many criticized as being contrary to democratic principles, as being secretive, as being in many cases corrupt, and in general contrary to the requirements of democracy, because diplomacy above all else required secrecy. And secrecy inherently is contrary to democratic accountability. Democratic decision-making requires that people have access to information. Diplomacy requires exactly the opposite. This is one of the reasons why the United States was keenly interested in abandoning diplomacy and replacing it with what Woodrow Wilson called open covenants openly arrived at. In other words, a system like the League of Nations in which states could openly discuss their conflicts and openly come to various agreements and therefore be accountable to their general publics and not undermine democratic principles. The most important aspects of international law as it exists today derive from the UN Charter. The UN Charter that was passed in 1945 is the cornerstone of international law today. Since that time, there have been a number of other treaties that have been passed. So, for example, the United Nations passed a declaration in favor of the independence of colonies in 1960. There have been treaties negotiated with regard to the use of torture, in which virtually all states, including the United States, are signatories and have committed themselves to refrain from engaging in any kind of torture under any circumstances. Indeed, the Torture Convention provides fairly substantial sanctions for those that do engage in torture. In other words, every member of that torture, every signatory to the Torture Convention is committed not to torture and to bring to trial any citizens of their state that have been found or have been accused of engaging in such torture. A similar treaty exists with regard to landmines. Landmines have long been a major plague on international politics, in large part because, as many have argued, they are contrary to the laws of war. And we'll talk about the laws of war in a few more minutes. Largely because landmines are indiscriminate. They're used on a fairly regular basis in wars, but one of the biggest problems with landmines is that they can't be targeted on anyone specifically. And as such, they become major problems, especially once those wars are over. So, for example, if you visit the country of Vietnam today, one of the things that you might notice is the rather large number of amputees in Vietnam, amputees that in some cases are teenagers or children. Why? Because there are still millions of landmines scattered throughout Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos from the Vietnam War that remain unexploded. Therefore, if you visit Vietnam and go on some hiking trips and so on and so forth, I strongly recommend it. It's a beautiful country, great food, great people, amazing surroundings, but try to stick to the paths. Don't be walking off into the rice paddies. It's extremely dangerous, and in particular not into the forests. You might well find yourself stepping on a landmine. The Landmine Convention has not been accepted as international law, and one reason for that is that there are still some important holdouts. One of the important holdouts that has yet to sign onto the Landmine Convention is the United States. The United States, in essence, because it insists that landmines are necessary under some circumstances, and in particular points to the situation in the Korean Peninsula as being one of those instances, where essentially the demilitarized zone that separates North Korea from South Korea is heavily armed on both sides, but also is laden with landmines to prevent or to discourage an invasion across that demilitarized zone. In that sense, they are still seen by some in the international system as absolutely vital tools in certain circumstances. The International Convention on Genocide is a similar instance that has actually come into effect, although how effective it has been in preventing genocide is still very much an open question. The Genocide Convention was proposed by Theodore Lemkin immediately after the Second World War, but to a large extent languished in the United Nations until the 1980s. Again, it was the United States that was the last signatory on the Genocide Convention when Ronald Reagan signed it in the 1980s. Let me go back to talking about the different kinds of international law. The best way to understand it is to separate it into three different categories. The first category is what is usually called constitutional international law. And that is what creates the basic institutions of the international system. The most important of that constitutional aspect of international law is the law of sovereignty. The law of sovereignty. Sovereignty is still the core of international law. It is the trump card of international law. All states are supposed to be sovereign, and that means that they should be free from the interference in their internal affairs by other states, unless those other states are authorized by their government to do so. Along with that goes the idea of the self-determination of nations. The self-determination of nations. Now, it is a very important and indeed the cornerstone of international law. Does that mean that sovereignty is always protected? Does that mean that all states are sovereign in the international system and that no states interfere in the internal affairs of their neighbors? Of course, the question almost answers itself. Of course it does not. Of course it does not. States on a regular basis cheat in this regard. The most blatant way of cheating is spying on each other. Looking at communications in other countries by sending agents and so on and so forth into those countries. In many cases, sending in various kinds of agents in order to create conflict within the boundaries of a particular state that you don't particularly like and so on. And again, to a certain extent, it boils down to, once again, the notion that the powerful do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. So in terms of more contemporary politics, one of the best examples of the violations of sovereignty of various states is the apparatus of spying that has been created since the September 11th attacks in the United States, especially the spying activities of the National Security Agency. Basically, as Edward Snowden's revelations made clear, the NSA has been spying on pretty much everyone around the world, collecting all of their communications via telephone, via email, and so on and so forth, and keeping track of them, including some rather important people. So, for example, one of the revelations was that the NSA was spying extensively on the German public, which caused somewhat of a ripple among the German public. But the government at the time that it was revealed, Angela Merkel, kind of shrugged her shoulders and said, didn't say much about it. Until it came out a couple of weeks later that her cell phone was also being monitored by the NSA. And then she made a big stink. So again, to a certain extent, the leaders generally tend to be more concerned about themselves than about their citizens. But suffice it to say, that created a big stink, because essentially spying on everyone around the world, private citizens, businesses, and state leaders, is a clear violation of the sovereignty of those states. And when asked about that, Mr. Obama said, well, the reality is, yes, it's, we are spying, but every country spies. Every country on the planet tries their best to spy on their neighbors, to spy on their adversaries. And allies invariably can become adversaries in the future. That means that we also have to spy on our allies, because we want to know when they're thinking of breaking out of the alliance or moving in a different direction. And in order to do that, we have to spy on them. And that, as such, all states do whatever they can to gather as much intelligence, as much information as they possibly can on all other members of the international community. And that is certainly true. But then came the clincher. Obama's clincher was, we're not going to apologize just because we're better at it than everyone else. And indeed, the United States is far better at it than everyone else, in large part because they have organizations like the National Security Agency that has the technological capacity to spy on everyone else on the planet, whereas most other countries don't have that capacity. And again, in that sense, the powerful do what they wish, and the weak suffer what they must. In that regard, things haven't changed very drastically. That's constitutional international law. Then the second category is fundamental international law, the basic norms of coexistence. And what we mean by that is the institutions of diplomacy and various treaties which form essentially contracts in international law. The basic idea of multilateralism falls into that category. Lastly, there are issue-specific regimes. And these are the things that I talked about earlier, in which international law takes the form of treaties, like the treaties banning torture, the treaties banning genocide, and so on and so forth, that try to create international norms by which states are expected to abide. the ability to enforce those norms is still something that's fairly problematic, and we'll discuss that in a bit more detail. International law also functions to a large extent on what jurists call opinio juris. In other words, in many ways they are based on custom. In that regard, custom or customary law is yet another form or another source of law. What that means is essentially that when there is a general observance of a particular norm in the international system, even if it is not codified as law in the UN Charter, it is considered as law in the international system. Now, let's move on to the problems with international law. International law, as I pointed out, was quite clearly seen by liberals as a means of diminishing the sovereignty of individual states, of making the planet as a whole more governable through both international law and international organizations. And as such, the idea was that these international laws, things like the Anti-Torture Convention and so on, could be enforced against countries that participate in these kinds of activities. And indeed, there are a number of organizations, not specifically related to the United Nations, that see their goal as precisely that, as trying to enforce these kinds of norms against countries that violate them. The most important in that regard are human rights organizations. Human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and so on and so forth, that essentially try to monitor the extent to which various states abide by these laws, and then try to force those that don't abide by them to observe them. And do so primarily by trying to embarrass those governments by issuing reports to the media and so on and so forth, and by putting pressure on other states in cases of severe violations of these norms, to sanction those countries and pressure them toward adopting policies in keeping with international norms. In that sense, international law always had the ambition of becoming, to a certain extent, supranational. In other words, bypassing sovereignty. And this is an important thing to keep in mind, is that international humanitarian law, like the prohibition on extrajudicial executions, for example, or the use of torture, and so on, aren't really particularly meaningful so long as states are sovereign. And essentially, to highlight that to a certain extent, basically the idea of sovereignty was that it's nobody's business how a ruler of a particular sovereign territory treats his own citizens. It's merely the business of that government. In other words, if how a particular country seeks to keep domestic order is its own sovereign business. And if they do so, as for example Syria did on a number of occasions, even before 2011, where whenever a particular protest or action against the government took place, as it did in the 1980s in Hama, under the father of Bashir al-Assad, they basically make an example of that village by destroying the whole village. Quite clearly indiscriminate, quite clearly a violation of the basic norms of the international community, but nobody's business except for the Syrian government. And this, to a large extent, was the norm throughout most of history, since the creation of the idea of sovereignty under the Treaty of Utrecht. More recently, however, that has started to diminish. In other words, it has become prevalent in the United Nations itself to reject the idea that sovereignty can protect international criminals. And it's for that reason that the United Nations, from the outset, created various means, on the one hand, to settle disputes between states. So one of the other core institutions of the United Nations is the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice, unlike the rest of the United Nations, which is located in New York, the International Court of Justice is located in The Hague. And its function is to settle disputes between states. Disputes between states. It has been somewhat successful in settling some disputes between states, but again, is flawed in many ways, suggested by realists. A good illustration of that is the conflict between the United States and Nicaragua during the 1980s. In 1979, the government of Nicaragua, the dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza, was overthrown by a movement called the Sandinistas that established a new government under their control, somewhat modeled on the government in Cuba. And the United States, of course, did not like that, just as they didn't like Cuba, and did their best to try to reverse that situation. Tried to reverse it first and foremost by supporting insurgents that tried to overthrow the Sandinista government, supporters of the previous government. They never were very successful in that regard, but also tried to do so by undermining the economy of Nicaragua. And one means of undermining the economy and therefore weakening that government, making it more vulnerable to overthrow and to regime change, to use current lingo in that regard, was to disrupt trade. And consequently, the CIA apparently started to mine the harbors of Nicaragua to disrupt their shipping and their ability to export goods and to import goods into their harbors. Nicaragua took that case to the International Court of Justice and stated that this was a clear violation of their sovereignty and contrary to international law. And the International Court of Justice agreed with them and essentially stated that the United States should pay reparations and should cease and desist from that activity. Anyone know what happened thereafter? The Americans simply declared it was none of the UN's business. Basically, they said, well, this should have been settled in the OAS, an organization that in the 1980s they controlled almost entirely, and that since it was under the OAS's, the Organization of American States jurisdiction, the UN had no business interfering. It simply ignored the decision altogether. Again, the powerful do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. And no matter how much international law there is, ultimately that picture hasn't changed that much. Another component of that, one that is more relevant to the idea of sovereignty, however, is the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court was from the outset supposed to be a part of the UN system, in essence because of the recognition after the Second World War that the international community simply could not stand by while certain kinds of crimes were being committed within the sovereign territory of a state. In particular, they could not abide by things like genocide. And therefore, means had to be created to hold those that were responsible for those kinds of crimes against humanity and war crimes accountable. And that was the purpose of the International Criminal Court. The problem for the International Criminal Court is that it never became established, and one reason it never became established is because before it could be firmly established, the international system became involved in the Cold War. In other words, the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, and that meant little progress could be made. Basically because anything that the United States tended to support, the Soviet Union was likely to veto, and vice versa. Essentially that meant that the United Nations throughout the Cold War was to a large extent crippled by the veto power of the core members of that institution, the United States and the Soviet Union being the most important in that regard. Consequently, it wasn't until the end of the Cold War that major efforts were made toward the creation of the International Criminal Court, and they weren't immediate. They were largely the result of the disasters that occurred after the Cold War. In particular, the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the civil war that broke out in the territory of Yugoslavia that saw extensive ethnic cleansing of Bosnians and Croats and Serbs in various parts of Bosnia-Herzegovina and elsewhere. And perhaps even more graphically, the incidents that occurred in 1994 in Rwanda, in which there was a genocide of large numbers of Tutsis and moderate Hutus that were slaughtered by the government of Rwanda. Basically, that created a situation in which the international community once again recognized that sovereignty had to have limits, and that there had to be institutions that could reach into states to hold leaders of states accountable for crimes against their own communities, not just for crimes against other states. Again, it took some time to create those courts. So the first means of holding these individuals to account were somewhat like the ad hoc courts that were organized at the end of the First World War. Basically, the tribunals in Nuremberg and in Tokyo that tried war criminals in Germany and Japan were essentially intended to be the model for the International Criminal Court. In the 1990s, essentially the same thing was created for Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. In other words, temporary courts to hold the violators of international law responsible within those courts. The one for Rwanda was created in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, and the one for the trials of war criminals in Yugoslavia was created again in The Hague, in the Netherlands. And they were successful in holding some of the members of those various militias to account and sending them to long jail terms and so on. Out of that grew the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court was going to be a permanent installation to deal with these kinds of issues and to prevent the repeat of these kinds of violations of international humanitarian law. Global governance in that regard, in particular with regard to human rights, increasingly had to overcome sovereignty. And in close association with that, the United Nations adopted in the 1990s again the doctrine of the responsibility to protect. The responsibility to protect. Yes, sovereignty was still the cornerstone of international law, but sovereignty had its limits. The international community had a responsibility to protect the vulnerable regardless of their location and to prevent massive slaughters of that sort. Has it been successful? Well, it has not, or at least its success has been rather mixed. Certainly there have been individuals that have been brought to the International Criminal Court, but those members of the international community that have been brought to the International Criminal Court all had one thing in common. Does anyone know what they all had in common? They were all from Africa. They were all from Africa. Now, is Africa the only place in the world where there's international where there's violations of human rights and so on and so forth? Of course it isn't. Was it evenly applied in Africa? Well, certainly not. And did it prevent various slaughters in Africa? Again, at the end of the slaughter in Rwanda, the international community declared never again. But almost immediately after the slaughter ended in Rwanda, it continued in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And indeed, between 1996 and 1926, it is estimated by the United Nations that in the Democratic Republic of Congo, more than 10 million people have lost their lives. And that's a pretty enormous figure for a single country. The Democratic Republic of Congo became the first African World War, in that various countries outside of the Congo backed various militias within Congo for various different reasons and created a bloodletting in the country that continues to this day. In that regard, it has not been particularly effective at reining in these kinds of human rights violations. But the more important thing is that there certainly have been important violations of international humanitarian law around the world, including in Africa, but only those in Africa have been held to account. Many would argue that, and I would put myself among them, that the United States in the War on Terror has been complicit in rather brutal violations of international law, most notably the Torture Convention. The Torture Convention is absolutely explicit about what it outlaws, and the United States is a signatory to the Torture Convention, and therefore all of its citizens should be held to account as well. No one in the United States has yet to be tried for that. Basically, in large part because the United States has opted out of the International Criminal Court. Not only has it opted out of the International Criminal Court, refused to sign it, but has also passed legislation in 2001 that goes a step further. It's called the American Service Member Protection Act that was passed by the Bush administration in 2001. And it commits the United States to preventing any American citizen from ever being brought to trial in The Hague. The measure is nicknamed the Invade The Hague Act. The reason being that international criminal law, like the Torture Convention, enjoys what is called universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdiction. And that means that a violator of those laws can be arrested anywhere on the planet, by any government on the planet, and handed over to the International Criminal Court. And that means that if, for example, Dick Cheney were to travel to Spain, a Spanish judge could sign an arrest warrant, have him arrested, and have him sent to the International Criminal Court for trial. Consequently, I suspect that Dick Cheney is watching his travel plans rather carefully, as are various other members of the American government that were complicit in these violations of international law. If he were arrested and sent to the International Criminal Court, what could the United States do to prevent him from being tried there? Well, the obvious implication is they could invade The Hague and rescue him, and they certainly have enough military power to do so. The United States rejected the International Criminal Court, essentially because it argued that the International Criminal Court subjects American citizens to crimes that are not considered crimes in the United States. Which is blatantly false, because the United States, insofar as the International Criminal Court simply enforces international law, and insofar as the United States is signatory to things like the Torture Convention, all treaties signed by the United States under the American Constitution are the law of the land. And in that sense, that is a rather poor excuse. The other excuse is that since the United States has military personnel in countries around the world, it is most likely to be subject to various kinds of prosecutions. And that would be unfair and would be counterproductive, because the United States would not be willing to become involved in these peacekeeping operations if their soldiers were permanently under the threat of this kind of prosecution. Furthermore, they argue that the International Criminal Court could be used as a political tool by American adversaries, and therefore result in politically motivated prosecutions that don't have any real justification in fact. Most supporters of the International Criminal Court consider these to be rationalizations as opposed to real objections to the International Criminal Court, in large part because the International Criminal Court functions on the basis that it only is activated if the country that is seen to have violated a particular part of humanitarian law is either unable or unwilling to bring those people to trial in its own court system. In other words, the United States would not have to invade The Hague to prevent Mr. Cheney from standing trial in The Hague. All they would have to do is declare their willingness to hold a trial within their own court system, and a fair trial, presumably, to hold Mr. Cheney to account. In that regard, much of that is somewhat misleading. Again, what it points to, however, is again the observation of realists. The powerful can do what they want and ignore the International Criminal Court, and the weak suffer what they must. In other words, those poor leaders in Africa that have been accused do get dragged in front of the court and do get tried. By the way, the African Union has declared its refusal to cooperate with the International Criminal Court, in large part because it's seen as, by much of Africa, as singling out African leaders unfairly for treatment that is ignored elsewhere in the world. And they certainly have something have a point in that regard. Not to say that those that have been tried have been innocent of these kinds of things, but quite clearly, those that were responsible for the slaughter in the Democratic Republic of Congo have not been held to account, whereas various other weaker players have been held to account. Let me talk a little bit about the laws of war and just war theory as another important component of international law and international organizations. Are there laws that govern how wars should take place? To many casual observers of international politics, that seems bizarre, that there should be laws in war. War is essentially the breakdown of law, the breakdown of order. So how can war be under the jurisdiction of any kind of law? Well, the reality is, however, that there have been laws in effect, again on the basis of opinio juris, in large part on the basis of their past observance by various combatants. And those laws of war are based on what is called just war theory, or just war principles. And just war principles were first articulated by Thomas Aquinas. In other words, they were first produced by the Catholic Church. And many have seen the emergence of just war principles as kind of an attempt by the Catholic Church to rationalize its own interests and its own policies. In other words, the Catholic Church, which teaches Christian doctrine, and to many Christian doctrine is largely pacifist. In other words, Jesus taught that when slapped by somebody, you turn the other cheek. You don't take revenge and things along those lines. All of which kind of point to a fairly extensive pacifism. On top of which, as the Pope reiterated, thou shalt not kill is one of the most important precepts of Christian teaching, which again points in the direction of a kind of a pacifism. But the Catholic Church was extensively involved in various wars, including things like the Crusades and so on, and used considerable brutality in those various wars, including perhaps most notoriously the recapture of the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors in the 14th century and 15th century, and the following Spanish Inquisition, in which torture was widely practiced and so on and so forth. Well, it had to rationalize that somehow, and one way to rationalize it was to come up with principles that justified war under certain circumstances. And as such, they developed certain aspects of international law over war that fall into two categories. The first is what is called jus ad bellum. Jus ad bellum refers to just cause and tries to define under what circumstances war is justified or resort to warfare is justified. And essentially, the main principles, and Michael Walzer has written a long and very interesting book about just war principles, so if you're interested in that, I strongly recommend that you take a look at that book. Basically, just to summarize very quickly, jus ad bellum refers to that just cause is only there insofar as a war is defensive in nature, is a defense against aggression, or an attempt to take territory wrongly taken, which comes to the same thing. Furthermore, war is only justified insofar as it is authorized by a proper authority, in other words, by a sovereign leader. And lastly, it is only legitimate insofar as it is a last resort, insofar as all other means of rectifying the injustice have led little to no results. Let me explain each of those quickly. The just cause as defense against aggression basically means, and this is embodied in the UN Charter, that the supreme international crime is to wage a war of aggression. To wage a war of aggression. In other words, a war that is not defensive in nature. And under the current UN system, that means that a war that is not authorized by the United Nations Security Council. And in that regard, many have argued that since the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was not authorized by the United Nations, it was a war of aggression. And that therefore those that authorized it, the Bush administration, are under that consideration essentially war criminals. Proper authority is also important. Proper authority means essentially that only sovereign leaders can authorize a war. Private citizens cannot. And the reason for that is perhaps a little bit more difficult to understand, but boils down to that war is very difficult to end. In particular, if it is not under the control of authorities capable of bringing it to an end. If every private citizen can organize their own private militias and attack a neighboring country, the problem with that is not only that they would start wars that their own government aren't particularly interested in, but they also start wars that their own government can't stop because they don't have the authority over those or the control over those militia leaders. This is very much the problem in the case of Syria right now. One of the problems with Syria right now is that nobody controls all of the various factions that are involved in that war. And that makes it extremely difficult to bring a conflict like that to a close. Various parties can negotiate and come to some kind of agreement, but there'll always be holdouts that aren't going to go along with that and will continue the armed conflict. And for that reason, it's very difficult to bring to a halt. Insofar as only state leaders are capable of authorizing wars, those state leaders are also capable of ending those wars. And consequently, proper authority is very important. And last resort is fairly evident. You don't start a war if the conflict can be settled by much cheaper and much easier ways through negotiations and so on. The second component of just war principles is what is referred to as jus in bello. Jus in bello. Well, before I get into jus in bello, I have over here the UN notion of self-defense and the UN Security Council. Basically, the just war principles have always recognized that self-defense is legitimate, and that the self-defense does not require that you have to wait for your adversary to fire the first shot. In other words, that preemptive strikes are legitimate acts of war under international law. If you see the neighboring country amassing troops on your borders and apparently preparing an invasion, you are authorized to take a preemptive strike against them in order to prevent their ability to do so, if you feel under an imminent threat of an attack. This was something that was rather important in that essentially the Bush administration in the lead up to the intervention in Iraq essentially argued that they were engaging in a defensive war. Defensive war in that Mr. Bush claimed that Mr. Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and ties to Al-Qaeda and was going to use those two in order to attack the United States, and that therefore the United States was acting defensively. Most international lawyers that have looked at the situation essentially argue that what happened in the 2003 war was not a preemptive strike, but rather a preventive strike. And preventive strikes are not legitimate under international law. Preventive strikes are strikes against a state that might hypothetically sometime in the future become a threat, but is not a threat yet. And essentially, that seems to be what occurred in the case of the invasion of Iraq. Again, under those circumstances, that was not a legitimate conflict. Jus in bello. Jus in bello has one primary requirement, one primary, most important requirement, and that is discrimination. And what is meant by discrimination is that, as has been observed by most states involved in war, that wars should be conflicts between armies, not between armies and civilians. In other words, that those involved in war have to make the best effort possible to avoid any harm to non-combatants, to civilians. And this is something that, well, was to a certain extent made necessary and or reinforced in terms of its necessity by the experience of conflicts like the 30 Years' War. 30-Year War was a civil war in which there were numerous militias and in which close to 2/3 of the population of what is now Germany disappeared as a result of that conflict, meaning that the violence was rather indiscriminate and affected both civilians and combatants. Since that time, however, since the establishment of the Peace of Westphalia, for the most part, wars have been fairly contained to affecting mostly or primarily only combatants. So in all wars that occurred between 1648 and the First World War, the ratio of casualties of combatants versus non-combatants was that 90% of all combatants in World War I and wars prior to that were combatants, and only 10% or so were civilians. In World War II, that situation was somewhat different. In World War II, roughly 60% of those that died in the Second World War were civilians. Only about 40% were combatants. And the reason for that should be fairly evident. The technologies that were used in the Second World War, in particular aerial bombardment, were by their very nature rather indiscriminate. And consequently, many have suggested that the use of aerial, of air power, of aerial bombardment is inherently a war crime. Because it violates that provision of discrimination. And that can certainly be applied to the use of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are so destructive that they make it impossible to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. They take out entire cities. Discrimination. Pardon me, before I abandon that thought, the Second World War saw 60% civilians and 40% combatant casualties. The wars since that time have become much, much worse. In Vietnam, as well as Korea, the ratio was 90% civilians to 10% combatants. And in most of the wars since that time, it has been close to that as well. And again, a lot of that has to do with the indiscriminate nature of the kinds of weaponry that are being used in modern warfare. Therefore, that requirement of a discrimination has had certain implications in particular for the kinds of weaponry that can be used. So for the most part, things like exploding or expanding and exploding bullets, gas, landmines, cluster bombs, white phosphorus, biological weapons, and nuclear weapons are highly problematic in this regard. Chemical weapons, like poison gas or biological weapons, have not been used extensively, in large part because they are indiscriminate. They were seen in World War I as ideal ways of wiping out entire armies, and consequently the Germans used them first, but the Brits and the French also used them subsequently on each other. And what they very quickly discovered is that they're not particularly good. Not that they're not good at killing, but basically they depend on elements that are not under the control of those that are commanding the armies. So the Germans very quickly discovered that when they released the mustard gas, when they had the wind to their back and it floated over British troops, there was a very strong possibility that the wind would turn and push the same poison gas right back at them. And in that sense, they weren't particularly effective as weapons. Consequently, they have not been used extensively in wars since that time, with some notable exceptions. Landmines, likewise, as I described earlier, tend to be rather indiscriminate. Not that they're indiscriminate, or that they couldn't be used in very specific purposes, such as the demilitarized zone between North Korea and South Korea, or the demilitarized zone between East and West Germany during the Cold War, as a means of creating separation barriers, but it's very difficult to remove them once those separation barriers are no longer necessary. And they tend to stick around and to have an impact on non-combatants. Cluster bombs are a similar kind of a situation. Cluster bombs are bombs that contain thousands of small bomblets, mostly in the form of little beads or little balls, usually metallic balls. And the idea of them is that they essentially scatter those small explosives over large areas and therefore destroy as many personnel as possible using those bombs. The problem with them is that especially the more primitive ones have only a fraction of those bomblets actually explode upon impact. And that means that there's hundreds of them lying around in various places where they've been used that subsequently become very attractive to kids that come across a shiny metal ball somewhere and pick it up and then have the thing go off and kill them or tear their arms off and things along those lines. Cluster bombs in that sense are indiscriminate. White phosphorus likewise is somewhat like a chemical weapon and is largely indiscriminate. I put a question mark behind nukes because this has not been specifically applied to nukes, but it's fairly evident that it should be applied to nuclear weapons in that they are enormous in their destructive capacities and by definition therefore difficult to use in a discriminate manner. A second area of jus in bello refers to the treatment of prisoners, prisoners of war. And this was most specifically the result of the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions predate the UN Charter, but were to a large extent adopted on the idea that soldiers are legitimate targets in war. As long as somebody is a soldier in uniform carrying a weapon, they are a legitimate target that can be killed by their adversaries. But the moment they are captured on the field and taken prisoner, they are no longer combatants, and consequently cannot be executed, cannot be tortured, cannot be subjected to interrogation, and so on and so forth. They have to be treated as private citizens. Again, that goes into the notion of discrimination. It's interesting to bring that up in the current context, and that this made a great deal of sense in World War I and World War II. If a German soldier was captured by the British in the field and removed from the battlefield, they no longer posed a threat to the British. Their arms were removed and they were brought into prisoner of war camps and essentially became private citizens. And to treat them unjustly was not only unfair to them, but also would result in similar treatment on the part of or with regard to British prisoners of war in German prisoner of war camps. Both sides would be better off if they treat their prisoners of war with basic respect and guarantee at least the means of livelihood and keeping them free from abuse. That all makes perfect sense. The other idea is that once hostilities end, those prisoners of war have to immediately be released to their home country and can become normal citizens of their home country again. The Geneva Conventions, as many of you might recall, were described by the Bush administration in the aftermath of September 11th as quaint. Quaint, meaning outdated. They no longer apply. In other words, the United States, to a large extent, rejected the idea of prisoners of war and the rights of prisoners of war, in particular in the context of places like Abu Ghraib, the Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, where large numbers of prisoners were held by the United States, and most notoriously, of course, in Guantanamo Bay. Why did they reject that? In essence, the Bush administration rejected it on some relatively solid grounds, and I say that with some hesitation since I'm not inclined toward defending the Bush administration's war on terror on too many grounds. However, what they did point out is that the war on terror in this regard is a very different kind of a war from the war from a conventional war between states. It is very different, first and foremost, because the war on terror, or the war, insofar as it can be considered a war, was not started by just authority or proper authority. It was started by the attacks of September 11th, which were not authorized by a particular state, but were authorized by Osama bin Laden, who had no authority to authorize such strikes. And that therefore, the terrorists involved in this war cannot be considered the same as soldiers. Certainly, a German soldier, once he's captured in the field in World War I or in World War II, ceased to be hostile toward their adversaries, ceased to be a threat to their adversaries. And once the war was over, once peace had been declared, should certainly have been welcomed back to their own country and freed and returned to normalcy. Can you say the same thing about those that are interned in Guantanamo Bay? Well, putting aside the fact that there was a lot of people that ended up in Guantanamo Bay that had no business being there to begin with. In other words, that one of the reasons that many of them ended up there is because the Americans offered a ransom, or rather a reward for anyone in Afghanistan willing to turn over foreign fighters, which were assumed to be a part of Al-Qaeda. And that meant that anyone that saw any foreigner immediately said, hey, that guy's Al-Qaeda, and got their $20,000 reward or something along those lines. And that's how large numbers of people ended up in Guantanamo Bay that had no connection to terrorism whatsoever. But putting those aside for the minute and looking only at those that were actively involved in the hostilities and were members of Al-Qaeda, could you assume that after they spent some time in Guantanamo Bay, they could at any point be released and assumed to be perfectly at peace with the United States? Well, it's obviously questionable. And this is precisely what the Bush administration pointed to in saying that the Geneva Conventions can't apply to Guantanamo Bay. Of course, the Bush administration went a step further than that, in that one of the requirements of the treatment of prisoners is that the International Red Cross be given access to prisoners of war in order to monitor whether they are being fairly traded. The International Red Cross has never been given access to Guantanamo Bay. In that regard, the Bush administration probably went a step further than that. Lastly, in regard to jus in bello, there are provisions with regard to the use of certain things like children, child soldiers, which have become a prominent feature of wars, in particular in civil wars, and in particular in Africa, but not exclusively in Africa. The use of rape as a weapon of war, likewise, is something that has been extensively documented in a number of different conflicts, most prominently in Yugoslavia, but also to a considerable extent in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Rwanda, and so on and so forth. Those are likewise contrary to international law and contrary to the principles of jus in bello. And of course, the indiscriminate use of force. We've already talked about war crimes and the Nuremberg laws and the International Criminal Court for Yugoslavia and Rwanda in the Rome Treaty, so I won't talk about that too much. And that kind of brings us to our next topic for next week, which is terrorism. And I know I've overstayed my welcome in this room on many, many occasions so far this week. And luckily, today I managed to get through all of my material with 20 minutes to go. So let me briefly see if there's any question about international law or organization. Everything's crystal clear. I've explained everything with total clarity. I hope so. I sort of doubt it, but I hope so. In that case, have a great day, and we'll see you all next week for an exciting discussion, I hope, of terrorism.